A BB for Hody and straight black pride, brothers and sisters. This is your brother, DC Radical 1, with another episode of DC's Radical Thoughts. This is episode 2 of volume 1 of this podcast. And today I want to discuss the father of racism. Now, when I'm talking about the father of racism, I'm not talking about an individual person. I'm not talking about the father in that sense. I'm talking about the father of racism as in the idea which would eventually spawn the concept of racism. You see, one of the things that kind of irritates me for whatever reason is when I hear black people talk about racism as if it's an American phenomenon. You know, something racist will happen and black people will say, oh, that's America. America this, America that. And I'm not saying that America is not racist, because of course America is racist. One could easily make the argument that America was founded on racism. Racism is encoded in the Constitution of the United States, where black people are 3/5 of a human being. And weirdly enough, once you make a mathematical equation, you have to make the inverse of the mathematical equation to get back to the number 1. So despite the later amendments, black people have never been made full human beings in the Constitution, in reality. But that is not the subject of today. That will take some visual aids. But when I talk about racism, in this case, the racism I'm talking about is anti-blackness. And the idea that anti-black racism started in America or with America is just downright silly. And to think that only America is racist is just naive. For example, I've seen black people, especially younger black people, and they'll travel to Europe and Australia and places like this, places with majority Europeans, and some incidents will occur, and they'll be surprised at the racism in Europe. Like, I don't understand the shock there. And then you have people that'll go to places like Japan or somewhere in what they used to call the Far East, and they'll be surprised at the racism there. But again, I don't understand why people are shocked, because Asian people in our neighborhoods are racist. They call us names behind our back in their language. They cuss us out in their language when you go buy something from them, which is why I haven't bought anything from them in a long time, in their corner stores and whatnot, their carryouts. I don't frequent those places very often. But we never look and say, what's really the origin of racism? Why does, and let's just be honest, why does everybody, every group on earth look down on black people? Why does everybody hate black people? What is the root of this hatred of black people? And how far back can we go and see where it started? And so, just want to talk about something that we never really talk about, and we never really point to this group of people and their doctrine and their ideology. And I'm going to look to John Henry Clarke. He pointed us in the proper direction on this. I can't exactly remember the speech, but John Henry Clarke brought up a salient point. And basically he said that if we look in the direction of the doctrine of the chosen people, that's a good place to start with really the first ideology of racism. Now, this wasn't anti-black racism, but it's the kernel that would give rise to anti-black racism. And if you look at it, it's very simple. When you look at the Bible, which the Torah is supposed to be the first 5 books of Moses, the bad guys in the Moses story are African. Now, a lot of people like to dispute the blackness of ancient Kemet. Moses allegedly lived 3,000 years ago. And so the pharaoh of that time would have been a black pharaoh. But beyond that point is something that I saw a Jewish person say. I believe he was Orthodox Jewish based on how he was dressed. He said that Jews were the best people because God had offered the Torah to everyone, and they were the only people who accepted it. That was his premise. Apparently, that's part of their religious teaching. Now, again, this, if you look at it, is the root basis. This is, in essence, Jewish supremacy. Because if out of the now billions of people, and let's say at that time hundreds of millions or a billion or 2 people at the time of Moses, you're saying that all other people are lesser than because they did not accept the quote unquote word of God. But my question is simply this: when did Moses or Abraham or any of the Old Testament prophets, when did they go to Australia? When did they come to North America? When did they come to South America? When did they go to the Caribbean? When did they go to Russia? When did they go to Zimbabwe? See, what I'm trying to understand is when you really look at these religious doctrines, this belief that God rejects 97.5% of the population, approximately, and chooses a very small group of people, I tend to disagree with that statement. Why would the all-knowing, all-wise creator of the universe make the so-called chosen people such a tiny minority? And why would he make them basically the last people to come on the planet? I have questions. But beyond that, if we look at it, if we look at this Zionism, not the Zionism of Theodore Herzl, but the Zionism of Jewish people are the best people and every other people are barely above animals, because this is what they believe. This is what's in their Talmud. That's why they don't hand out Talmuds to everyone, because then people will see what they actually believe. But to me, when I look at it, this is the root of what will become racism / white supremacy. And also, if you look at it, the root of anti-blackness. See, one of the things that people never really think about or really talk about is that the curse of Ham, that used to be something talked about a lot and was in the Bible, or I guess still is in the Bible, and it was alleged at the time, based upon Jewish teaching, to refer to black people, black African people, and is allegedly the reason that we have our features, right? That's anti-blackness. Now that goes back at least, I don't really know when the Bible was finalized, but that's a story that goes back, let's say 2,000 years or more than 2,000 years. We have an anti-black religious story that's over 2,000 years old. And what we don't think about is that same story was taught and maintained by the people that would become Christians. And the Christians would eventually be Europeans. And that same story was taken to the Arabs, the Arab Muslims. And they would carry that story. And they would eventually use a similar rationale to focus the Arab slave trade on black people. And what we don't look at is that the Arab slave trade not only extended into the west from Arabia into Africa, and of course the north into Europe and parts of Asia, but all the way to the east to China. So many Eastern people, meaning Chinese people, their first viewing and their first meeting of black people was at the point of being enslaved by Arabs. And so that anti-black thread going all the way from the curse of Ham spread literally around the world, laying the seed for anti-blackness. But nobody ever discusses this. We always hear about how marginalized other people are. But no other people that I know of, other than black people, have been denigrated in people's religion. In essence, in the three of the major religions of the world are rooted in anti-blackness. And all of that can be traced back to the curse of Ham and the belief in the exceptionalism of the people that we now call Jews. Now, I'm not going to get into the origin of the Jews and whether the people that we see that are Jews today are related to the biblical people. I'm not going to get into that discussion. That's a discussion for another day. But my point is that when we look at Zionism and we look at, and when I say Zionism, I'm not talking about just the political Zionism, but the religious Zionism. The belief that the Messiah will come and he will, of course, be the king of the Jews. And since the majority of people who claim to be Jews now are white, by extension, the Messiah will be white. And then by extension of that, even though they believe that God's a non-corporeal entity, but in essence, God and the Messiah is favoring whites, then realistically, this is the root of what we would call white supremacy. So not only is Zionism the root of anti-blackness, but Zionism is the root of white supremacy as we now have it. Because think about it. For a long time, if we look at how Jews were treated in the South during the enslavement era, we have the documentation. We have The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 1 and Volume 2. There was no anti-Jewish sentiment. Jews at that time were actually called by many people Hebrews and were looked at as the people of the Bible, and thus were looked at as God's chosen people. Let's be realistic. A bunch of Christians are not going to run around persecuting and killing the people that they think are God's chosen people. That didn't happen. That's historically inaccurate. It's a myth. The simple reality of the situation is that we look back at antebellum Southern America. Jewish people were doing quite well, whether they were involved in the slave trade or they were involved in some other types of trade and commerce. They didn't suffer the same type of denigration and degradation and the destruction of their history and culture and the disparaging of their character That was black people that suffered that. All of the ills and all of the hatred and all of the vitriol in this society, black people were the original hated people in this society. But black people were the original hated people around the world, going all the way back to the curse of Ham and the exceptionalism of the chosen people. And this anti-blackness, as I said, has spread around the world. Not only has it spread to, as I said, China and India and, of course, Europe and America, but even South America, where, you know, they've been affected by the European indoctrination. And they, you know, places like Mexico, where people have secret black relatives that they don't talk about. They don't bring the pictures out and things like that. And sometimes randomly, one of the children just randomly darker than everybody else, and everybody's looking around trying to figure out what happened, because they don't know that their grandmother's mother was 3/4 black. And so I just wanted to bring that out and point that out, because one of the things we see, if you actually listen to Jewish people and listen to how they talk, not just about black people, but how they talk about Arabs and how they talk about a lot of different people, very rarely is Jewish racism called out. And there's a lot of it, especially among Israelis. But you also see it here. Here is more subtle, it's more quiet, it's said more amongst themselves. But let's be realistic. You go to New York and get the average Jewish person mad, and they'll let you know what they really think about you as a black person. I've seen it personally, right? But nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to really look at the root and see where did all this hatred and vitriol and venom for black people come from. And so for our people, it's important for us to know and understand these things so that we're not sitting around making friends with people who have declared us enemies, making friends with people who engineer our enslavement, not just in the what is known as a transatlantic slave trade or the Great Maafa, but one of the rare things that's rarely talked about, the simple fact that the Jews had a hand in the Arab slave trade. Now you're gonna ask me, with DC, how do Jews have a hand in the Arab slave trade? Well, the Jews were in Arabia before Prophet Muhammad, and the Jews were in Arabia after Prophet Muhammad, and the Jews traveled along the same spaces that where the Arabs traveled and took over and conquered lands. The Jews were right there. The Jews were right there doing trade. The Jews were right there doing commerce. The Jews were right there helping to write treaties, right? And to document history and things like that. They were right there. So that's an aspect of history that almost no one talks about, no one really wants to delve into, and no one wants to speak about. It's almost like a dirty little secret. And so, you know, like I said, I saw a couple of different Israelis saying some pretty vile and terrible things about the Arabs. Some of this was before the whole Hamas thing, some of it after. And I just wanted to, you know, point this out and to let black people know, and other people, that racism is not just an American thing. You can find racism in Canada. And I'm talking about, in this case, anti-black racism. You can find anti-blackness in Canada. You can find it in Mexico. You can find it in the Caribbean. You can find it in South America. Basically, virtually anywhere you can go on this planet where black people are not the complete and total majority, you will find anti-black racism. And indeed, it's so pervasive that you can go in a room with black people and the hatred of black people will permeate the black people, and that self-hatred will come through. You'll see the self-hatred in the hairstyles of the women. Sometimes you'll see the self-hatred in the hairstyles of the men. You'll see the self-hatred in the clothing that's worn. You'll see the self-hatred in the calling ourselves a racial slur, right? Now, we don't ever want to talk about it, but let's just be honest. The people that control the music industry, they allow black people to call themselves racial slurs over records all day long, and have for the last 30 years. More than 30 years now, 35 years. Black people have been inwarding up a storm, denigrating ourselves, disrespecting our women. No Jewish person has stopped us from doing this. Liar Cohen hasn't stopped us from doing this. Think of any other record executive. They've never recommended that we stop doing this. They've just all let us continue inwarding ourselves, B-wording ourselves to death, N-wording ourselves to death, talk about shooting and killing each other, and they've let it go on and on. But think about it. When is the last time you heard a rapper use a derogatory term for any Jewish person? I don't know. The last time I remember hearing it was an Ice Cube with this song of NWA, No Vaseline. That song is 33, 32 years old. I mean, I'm not saying definitively that's the last time, but that's the last time I remember. But black people can denigrate themselves all the time over the records that are owned and manufactured and processed and distributed by largely Jewish owned corporations. And so, brothers and sisters, I just wanted to point this simple fact out, because it's not something that we talk about. It's not something that we look at. It's almost like a dirty little secret, and we have to we have to be aware of the root of some things and understand that some things are just bigger than America, and some things are global, and we have to look at how they became global. The hatred for black people came before the slave trade. And so that's my latest of DC's Radical Thoughts. I thank you all for listening. If you're listening via YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. With that, I say BB for Hodier and straight black pride. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also follow us on our other social media platforms. On Instagram, we're at dc.radical, the number 1. On Twitter, we're at dc_radical_ONE. And the Cash App is $DC Radical 1. Again, thank you for subscribing. A BB for Hodier and straight black pride.